Welcome to the Blue Security Podcast, a weekly podcast for information security defenders, where we bring you discussions on best practices, tools, and implementation for enterprise security. Now, here are your hosts for today's show, Andy Jha and Adam Brewer.
Welcome to another episode of the Blue Security Podcast. I'm Andy, your host.
I'm Adam, your co-host.
This week, I wanted to talk about IBM's report titled Cost of a Data Breach. And this is the year 4's report. They come out with this every year. We talked about theirs last year as well. So this is the newest one. This was actually released a couple months ago, but the information is still really good. And as we go into like budgetary season, end of the year, and you're prepping for the new calendar year, there's some good info in here on how you might want to allocate your costs based on really where the dangers are, where the risks are, and then how you're going to try to mitigate that as far as a data breach goes. The report includes data from 604 organizations that were impacted by data breaches between March 2023 and February 2024 in 16 different countries and regions. And it also includes firsthand knowledge from 3,500 plus security and C-suite business leaders that were impacted by those breaches. So a lot of good information in here. Well worth the read, but we'll talk about some of the key findings. So first and foremost, on average cost. The cost of a data breach jumped to 4.88 million from 4.45 million back in 2023, which is a 10% spike and also the highest increase since the pandemic. When you have that, when you're factoring in the rise of that cost, it includes loss of business, including the operational downtime, lost customers, cost of post-breach responses such as staffing customer service help desk, paying higher regulatory fees, and all of that factored into that increase in the cost. So it's not just the data itself or the ransom that you're paying. It's everything, including the response and the aftermath of possible downtime and loss of customers. So when you take that all together, the cost total about $2.8 million. And that is the highest combined amount for lost business and post-breach activities over the past 6 years. So a lot of money in this. That the numbers itself, I think, are fairly staggering. Yeah, when it comes to tools and cost savings, the report actually found that 2 out of 3 organizations that were included in the study, 2 out of 3 organizations said that they were deploying security AI and automation across their security operations center, which is about a 10% jump from the previous year. When they deployed AI extensively across the prevention workflows like attack surface management, red teaming, posture management, organizations averaged about $2.2 million less in breach costs compared to those with no AI use in prevention workflows. This finding was the largest cost savings revealed in the 2024 report. So I found that to be an extremely interesting key finding and statistic.
Agree. It stood out to me right away, and it didn't hurt you have it in bold in our show notes, Andy. But that's a big number. Almost 50% of the total average cost of a breach. But what stood out to me more is those aren't things I generally consider to be quote unquote AI workloads in security. Things like posture management, attack surface management, like those are, to me, not really AI enabled things. Those are things that are, you can augment them with some sort of like machine learning models and just some algorithms to help direct your attention to maybe the most pressing or highly sensitive or highest risk posture findings or attack surface to remediate. This might be a little bit of inflation here where everything gets slapped with the AI tag. I mean, those seem to be, to me, pretty deterministic workloads when AI, at least a lot of what we think of AI today is by nature non-deterministic. Red teaming maybe less so. I've seen some rumblings and not intimately familiar with, but things like AI-enabled fuzzing, pen testing, stuff like that, where you can kind of throw an AI at your stuff and test it. I don't know enough about that to comment intelligently about it, but maybe that's where more of this is. But either way, the finding is clear that if you invest in things like attack surface management and posture management and red teaming, it decreases your average cost of a breach by almost 50%. And that's really the significant finding here, I think, above all else, whether or not you want to quibble if those are quote unquote AI enabled workloads.
I think even just using AI in those type of workloads can help because take posture management as an example. Earlier this week, I was sitting in a security copilot demonstration, and one of the things that the presenter was talking about was ingesting third-party threat intelligence, including like ISAC feeds, like Health ISAC or HISAC, into, say, Sentinel or just into a logic app, pulling from an API into a logic app, and then using Security Copilot to prompt whether or not you're susceptible to any of those CVEs. And that can be argued as possible attack surface management / posture management. And I asked that presenter if what he was doing could be accomplished without Copilot. And he said, absolutely. Like, you can do that, but you'd have to write an individual logic app to parse out that data and then pull it against, whatever threat management, vulnerability management program that you had. Whereas you could just use a simple prompt in Security Copilot. And now, like, I wasn't aware, but I saw that in Azure Logic apps, they have just an actual Copilot prompt, and you can just literally just enter your prompt in there as part of the Logic app. And so what assets of mine are susceptible to the CVEs that are pulled in from this threat? And it was just one simple prompt, and it was able to parse that into not only pull the data, but also then send out an email formatted in HTML. Whereas, like, if you wanted to do it yourself, you would have to write that code in HTML in order to send it out. So I think there are efficiencies gained from even just the simple attack surface management and posture management.
Fair point. And really, a lot of what you're talking about is not necessarily like doing net new discovery of those, but being able to work with it in a more natural language way or in a way that's in the context of an existing workflow. We're doing an investigation. We discovered it may have been the result of this CVE. What are my other resources that are impacted by that CVE that I should go patch right now? So I can go back to management and say, not only did we shut out the attacker, but we prevented it from happening again. We patched 300 systems and so on and so forth. Really good point. And it's worth mentioning, Andy and I do work for Microsoft. We both work in our security field sales business. This show is not funded by Microsoft, is not sponsored by Microsoft, and they have no editorial control over the show. We do this on our own time and on our own dime. So Andy was talking about a couple of Microsoft technologies there and Copilot for security, Azure Logic apps, and the like. So wanted to throw that out there as we continue the discussion of this IBM cost of a breach report, cost of a data breach report.
Another key finding is the growth of cyber skills shortage. And, when I say that, it basically is something that we've had to deal with every year. But what the report found was more than half of the breached organizations faced high levels of security staffing shortages. And this issue represented about a 26.2% increase from the prior year and corresponded to about an average of 1.6 million more in breach costs. Even though 1 in 5 organizations say that they use some form of generative AI security tool, which does help close that gap, this skills gap is still a challenge.
I just saw a friend of the show, Christina Murillo, was posting on Twitter the other day, really kind of negatively commenting on this concept of this cyber skills shortage. And I've seen this conversation come up a couple of times now on Twitter and LinkedIn and other places where some folks feel like this isn't real or this is a marketing concept. And obviously, this IBM report is not meant to be any of those things. IBM does really great work on this report annually. This is not a marketing document, I guess, just to be clear. So when they talk about this, they are talking about it as if it's a factual thing. I find this conversation interesting because folks are saying it's really difficult to get hired. It's not like I go out there and I can find a job tomorrow. It's difficult to get hired. And so maybe some of the conversation around this is not so much that these are just open headcount, open requisitions that you should just go blast out 10 resumes and you'll get 10 job offers. A part of this could be companies aren't funding these jobs right now or are understaffing their security operations centers and maybe should staff more but have chosen not to. That might be more of the case here. Just to add some context around this conversation, I personally have not been out in the job market trying to find a job, so I can't comment on it directly, but I see a lot of folks really have a visceral negative response to whenever this comes up. So I did just want to acknowledge this, that this isn't marketing speak here. This isn't a marketing deck. This is something meant to be really academic research. And here's IBM, a very trusted and respected organization, also my former employer, calling on this and saying this is still a thing. So I'm going to go with, hey, I understand it's hard to find a job. I do think we're understaffed in general. I don't think that's even a remotely sensational take to throw out there, that we do need more folks working in security operations and security engineering roles for sure. So let me say one other thing on this that I do like from this report. And that is IBM saying 1 in 5 organizations are using Gen AI security tools, and they, and I'm going to quote, are expected to help close the gap by boosting productivity and efficiency. This is a really good thing to point out because I have seen some folks really approach these Gen AI tools with resistance, with trepidation, because I think they're afraid it's going to take their jobs. And let me be clear, as someone who sells Microsoft Copilot for security for a living, this product is in no way, shape, or form taking anyone's job anytime soon. It's not anywhere near there. That's not the goal. That's not the focus. We often say it's meant to augment human ingenuity. It's meant to take what humans do well and make it more powerful. It's meant to take a junior analyst and power them up so they can act like a senior analyst. That's what these Gen AI tools are really meant to do, is up-level the skilling in your SOC, make your senior analysts more like super analysts, make your junior analysts more powerful, help everyone be faster, more accurate, more timely with all the work they're doing. That's the goal here. So I will say, as our listeners and viewers are taking in this show, that's something not to be afraid of. Between the last point and this point on this, the messaging is really clear that, hey, being understaffed costs in a breach, 1.76 million more in breach costs. And if you are starting to adopt some Gen AI tools, it can take almost 2 million out of your breach cost. So the messaging here is really clear. Yeah, IBM may have some Watson stuff they're trying to sell too, but in general, I think this finding is really clear that we have to help empower defenders more, because attackers have such an asymmetrical advantage in this cat and mouse game we're fighting. We need to avail ourselves of every tool possible. And tools do not replace people, process, and procedure. And I'm not saying they do, but implemented correctly, they can absolutely augment what your really talented people already do and make them even more impactful, help amplify their out.
Yeah, it's a good call out, Adam, because just because the data shows that people are understaffed does not mean that there are actual jobs out there. I think you talk to any security defender, they're probably overwhelmed, have more work than they, can do in an entire day, and they're overworked. Like they're probably doing the work of 2 or 3 people. Hiring someone could alleviate that load and help, increase your vigilance in your defense. but maybe that company isn't hiring for another person. They're capped at that position or whatever. And so I think being understaffed and having jobs available are two different things.
Mhm.
And also, like, I just want to echo what you said about boosting efficiency and productivity. I mean, this show is an actual example of how generative AI can help. Riverside, which is the platform that Adam and I use to record this show, has built in generative AI tools into the platform over time. Like, I don't know if they're going to increase the cost at some point, but they haven't increased the cost. They've just increased the number of features they have, and it has been incredibly beneficial. They are able to use generative AI. We could generate show notes from a recording. We can generate captions. We can do all of our editing. And there are some buggy features like initially. And if people were listening to the show, you might have noticed that there were some funky recordings where, we use some of the Gen AI tools to do the editing, and it might have cut off words where it was thinking that there were pauses. And so over time, we have noticed that the tool has gotten better as probably people have used it and more data has been siphoned through, and the tool has just improved in general. And so these Gen AI tools, as Adam put it, they're not like going to replace a person, because you still need someone to run them. They're not going to do everything for you. And even if they do stuff, you should double check and quality check the work afterwards, because they're not perfect. And so, but I will say, what used to take me 2 to 4 hours to edit an entire show now takes me about 2 minutes. And so that it has been a huge quality of life change. And that's the same type of change that you can, have when you're using the generative AI tools for the right purpose at an organization.
Agree completely. And I like how you just really succinctly put it, that because there's a shortage in terms of people sitting in roles does not mean there's open headcount. Those are not the same thing. And that's a really simple and succinct way of putting it. Organizations probably should hire more, but they're not. And the other thing I'll say too is, absolutely, these tools can help make people faster, more efficient, do all the things. In many cases, they are not a replacement for still doing that hiring. And I also want to make that point of, I sure as heck, and I know Andy is doing the same thing, we are not talking to CISOs and telling them, hey, if you buy this tool, you can hire less people in your SOC. We're absolutely not saying that. I'd have a hard time having that conversation if it ever came to that. That's not where my head's at, because we are still so short on everything we're doing. We're so far behind in everything we're doing as a security community. I am doing nothing but advocating for more tools, more headcount, more everything to help turn the tide against the flood of attacks we all are dealing with every day.
Another key finding that the IBM found in their report is 1 in 3 breaches involved shadow data. Now, what is shadow data? Essentially, it's data that exists in different places that you may or may not know about. And so they said about 35% of the breaches showed that the proliferation of data is making it harder to track and safeguard. Shadow data theft correlated to about a 16% greater cost of a breach. And researchers found that storing data across environments proved to be a common storage strategy, and accounted for about 40% of the breaches. Those breaches took longer to identify and contain. In contrast, data stored in just one type of environment was breached less often, whether that environment was a public cloud, on-premises, or private cloud. Adam has often made the point, I'll let him make it, but like when you start storing data in different places, like in Amazon, or duplicating data even, that really starts to make it a lot harder, especially if you don't have a good DLP strategy or you don't have a good data security strategy, which is probably one of the lesser mature areas that most organizations have today. It is starting to play a bigger role. Organizations are starting to realize how important it is. But traditionally, we have focused on endpoint security, email security, identity security, but data security, that has always kind of fallen back a little bit. And so in this just how much data we have today and how much generative AI is playing a role in making that data a lot easier to access and read. Data security is just starting to become probably the most important thing for a lot of organizations.
This touches on all of my favorite subjects, Andy. You probably saw me light up when I saw you talking about this. Number one, we've talked about on this show many times that you should retain as little data as possible. Number one, don't retain stuff if you don't need it, and really have that tough conversation about you don't need to pack rat data for a rainy day when you might start analyzing it, because it basically doesn't work that way. Number one. Number two, to your point, this is where organizations always get themselves wound up around having like their procurement team dictate strategy in hopes of saving a couple of bucks. That adds more risk across the board in terms of multi-cloud strategies or multi-vendor strategies. Those all sound good on paper. We're going to save money because we're not going to have, quote unquote, all our eggs in one basket. But the thing is, you put eggs in an egg carton for a reason, because it lets you carry 12 eggs at once really easily. Trying to carry a whole bunch of eggs in 9 different baskets adds a ton of complexity, and eggs are going to break then. To take that analogy, I think that's a bogus one. There are times when that makes sense. I understand spreading your risk. I get that. That's a valid strategy in many businesses. But in IT, it's not so cut and dry, because you are adding risk in other ways too. And this very succinctly lays it out for you that when you start having a strategy around we're going to duplicate data to protect it, or weird things like that, you are actually creating more risk. We're going to have a multi-cloud strategy to protect ourselves against downtime. Well, great. You're protected against downtime when the public cloud is really way more reliable than your on-premises ever was. But now you have no visibility into your data, and you don't have a unified data security strategy. There are trade-offs, is the long story short. I, of course, as I've already given the disclaimer and mentioned, working at Microsoft, we definitely have a point of view on security as a platform, and a single cloud strategy can be more beneficial. Think of the benefits of that and not just the risks, and don't lead with a procurement first strategy on those, when nowadays your procurement risk is we might pay a little more money. Your cost of a data breach risk, as we are laying out here, are significantly higher. So we need to challenge that traditional thinking of, oh boy, this vendor might raise our cost on our renewal 10% more than we expect, and say, well, yeah, but it's going to save us from a $4.8 million data breach instead. So let's get our heads focused where the greatest risk actually is. And it is almost never your procurement cost. So procurement should not lead your IT strategy. And I think that's a mistake folks make sometimes. So yeah, this is a good data here for sure. Get that shadow data out. And by creating a culture that just by default discards data, helps you reduce a lot of that risk.
So the report says that almost $5 million is the average cost of a malicious insider attack. Other expensive attack vectors were business email compromise, phishing, social engineering, and stolen or compromised credentials. Generative AI is starting to play a role, that we're starting to see that in phishing attacks specifically, because generative AI makes it a lot easier for non-English speakers to produce grammatically correct and plausible phishing messages. So definitely, we've talked about an insider risk program on different ways that you can, not only just from IT tools, but from employee satisfaction and different things that you can do to ensure that you don't have an insider risk attack. And so that's important. Another point in the report says there was seen about a $1 million cost savings when ransomware victims involved law enforcement, which excludes the cost of any ransom paid. Involving the law enforcement may shorten up the time to identify and contain breaches. One of the things is know who your law enforcement contacts are. There are local FBI resources specifically for cybercrime, state resources as well. So get to know who your contacts are. I've talked to the ones in Wisconsin for sure, and they have different intelligence reports that they're willing to share with the public that, probably a lot of people don't take the time to read or reach out to them. At least get to know them and know who they are if and when you need to actually use that.
Interesting that insider risk pops up here as well. This is like a laundry list of all of our favorite subjects here on the Blue Security Podcast. Insider risk is challenging. Fully acknowledge that. It is hard when all of our focus is on detecting and preventing attacks originating from outside the organization. And they require different skills, different tools. They're really challenging, but they're also really expensive. Basically $5 million if you get hit with an insider risk attack. And talking about how the threat has increased with Gen AI, we talked about Rachel Tobach on X or Twitter, talking about the amazing voice cloning technology that exists today and how astounding it is and how little of a sample you need to generate incredibly realistic sounding material. And keep in mind, all of your senior leadership, if you're a publicly traded company, are in publicly traded documents, who your CFO is, who your CEO is, who your COO is. It's not hard to track down them talking on a newscast or talking on a conference call on your quarterly report or whatever, and being able to call up somebody else as the CFO's voice and say, hey, you need to do a wire transfer to Bermuda ASAP. Tremendous risk from this today, more than ever. And just like data security before it, an area that organizations have under focused on to date. And we have sat here and acknowledged, hey, security teams are spread thin. They're asked to do too much. They're asked to do more with less. They need to hire more people. They need better tools. And here's another thing where we're saying, well, you got to do this too. I get it. It's a laundry list of stuff. But there are steps you can take that don't require additional tooling or anything else that can help mitigate insider risk. Check out our back catalog. We've talked about this before. And I love how Andy doesn't immediately go to, you need a tool. You need an insider risk management tool. He talks about things like, do you take care of your people? Are they happy? Do you have good benefits that help them if they're having a mental health crisis or financial crisis? Do they have access to tools, resources, benefits that can help them avoid situations where they get desperate or angry or upset and make really bad choices? So there's more you can do than just focus on this from a pure cybersecurity perspective, but it's an area that deserves your focus, because if you get hit with one, this is the biggest number we've seen in this report as we've been stepping through it. It's a big number, $5 million, average cost of an insider risk attack, malicious insider risk attack. So add it to your to-do list and make sure you're shoring up your internal defenses against folks who have a proverbial axe to grind against the company.
It's really interesting that you mentioned the voice phishing, because I just saw on Twitter someone who was complaining about Charles Schwab, and when you call in as a customer, they now have a feature, or maybe they've had one for a while, that your voice can be your password. So you just say that, and like they record your voice and then use that as a password with no other, information apparently. So if there's anyone who works at Charles Schwab that listens to this, podcast, maybe rethink that in the age of generative AI.
Talk about data you don't want to keep.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so a couple more things to talk about, and then we'll wrap it up here. $830,000. That was the largest average increase among all industries. It was the industrial sector that experienced the costliest increase, and the cost spike could reflect the need for industrial organizations to prepare more rapid response, as organizations in the sector are highly sensitive to operational downtime. Time to identify and contain a data breach at industrial organizations was above the median industry at 199 days to identify and 73 days to contain. That's still a staggering number. 199 days. That's like over 6 months to identify a breach. But sounds like, not only do they incur the most, costly increase over any other industry, fortunately, they do have a better response among their peers. And then One last thing, and then I'll let you respond, Adam. Here, 292 days to identify and contain breaches involving stolen credentials. So they called out specifically stolen credentials, but other attacks like phishing and social engineering were also called out, but they were a little bit quicker. 261 days for phishing attacks and 257 days for social engineering attacks. Either way, it still takes a long time for organizations on average to identify these and contain them. So we're looking at still a little bit short of, a year, but like 10 months for something involving stolen credentials. And the fact that we're still having breaches from credentials also kind of boggles my mind. So we'll talk about some takeaways in a little bit, but I want Adam to give you a moment to respond to those last two bullets there.
Yeah, I'll save cut Andy a little slack here. So Andy still works at Microsoft in our discrete manufacturing business. That's all he covers. I moved out of that business a year ago, so I don't want to take a shot at anyone, but I can confirm that business has work to do from a cybersecurity perspective. They tend to be a lot more family-owned businesses, a lot more privately held companies that just they have less regulatory scrutiny. And so they're just less familiar with having really strict requirements around really anything related to technology. Technology was an enabler to enable the rest of the business and then make more widgets and then go away. And that tends to still be a bit of the mindset there. So I'm not surprised to see this called out. Interesting that their time to detection is actually faster than their peer organizations in other industries. That's fascinating. But yeah, you hear these stories of industrial organizations getting hit and then their production line shut down. And any production line shutdown is expensive for them. They have gaps in their supply chain. I remember the Clorox company had cybersecurity incident maybe a year and a half ago. And they were literally saying like, yeah, we're not going to have any product on shelves for 5 weeks or something like that, because shutting down their production lines, even for a little bit, is a massive disruption to their entire supply chain. So it's one of those where you have to put pen to paper. Like if you are a mission critical organization that cannot go down here, then you invest elsewhere to make that possible. And it sounds like maybe for some of them, their cybersecurity spend hasn't been commensurate with that. And again, I blame part of this on, it's not their fault. It's just that businesses like financial services, they have had regulatory looking over their shoulder forever, or healthcare and life sciences, same thing. They've got HIPAA regulation and all sorts of other regulation around the world that really dictates how they run their business. And so they're familiar with, we must meet this requirement and that requirement and this audit finding and that. And manufacturing has kind of been left to their own devices and industrial organizations. So this is an emerging threat to them. And they just may need to rethink some of this because of how sensitive they are to these attacks and how it basically completely shuts them down. Other organizations can still run in a degraded mode. Healthcare can run, at least sometimes, with paper charts and stuff like that. And other organizations can find old pen and paper methods to still check you into your hotel room. But it seems like manufacturing and industrial businesses, if they have an attacker in there, they go down, like 100% down, and they're the ones who can least afford it. So very, very interesting finding here for sure. And then just to comment on the stolen credentials, and I know we're going to get to kind of takeaways and ways to mitigate. I agree with you. Like the whole concept of how'd your credential get stolen? I know not everyone is even remotely close to getting to phishing resistant methods, but it does underlie the necessity to get there. Get to the point when there's nothing that is easily stolen is one thing. And the other thing too is this signifies to me still a lack of looking at other signal around a sign-in beyond just credentials. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. But there should never be a scenario where somebody says, okay, here's my username, here's my password, here's my second factor, let me in. If that's all you're looking at, you're not looking at enough. What network are you coming from? What's the health of your sign-in? Is it anomalous? Are you signing in from a weird country? What's the health of your managed device? Is it compliant? Is it enrolled in my management program? How's your EDR? Anything going on that endpoint? Anything malicious or weird? I want to know before I let you in. And I should be looking at all of those things, not just at the time of sign in, but continuously. Every time your tokens renew in the background, even without the user being prompted, I should be checking all of those things. Has anything changed? Anything new? Anything I need to know about before I continue to allow you access to a thing? If you are all eggs in the basket of, well, the credentials are good, so I'm going to let you do whatever you want for 292 days or whatever it was, is crazy to me. There's so many other signals out there, and it's a matter of organizations availing themselves to those signals to really enhance and add more scrutiny around every sign in, every token redemption, every time.
Yeah, Adam, you kind of took a little bit of some of the takeaways here, but we'll start with this last one here.
Well, we'll talk about how to do that.
Yeah, I mean, credential protection, like we, both of us kind of marveled at the fact that stolen credentials is still a way to get in. Number one, have a way to have password protection. If you're using Microsoft and you're syncing those password hashes to Entra/Azure, then you can use password protection, and you can also block, based on one, common passwords, but also a custom list of passwords. And one of the things, when it comes to custom list of passwords, I always thought of, regional ones. Like for me, I'm in Wisconsin, so like Packers 2024 or Badgers 2024, Brewers 2024, stuff like that. Madison, Milwaukee, whatever city you're in. And so, if you're headquartered there, that plus 2024 is probably, with exclamation mark or whatever, is probably going to be a very common one. But what I did, I read something recently that this was not something that I was typically doing, but you can block something called the keyboard walk. Now, I know QWERTY is probably one that's already blocked in the common password, but are you blocking, QAZWSX, right? So if I look down, I can literally walk. This was one of the things in the military that we often would do, because back then, so think about like 20 years ago, and having to change your no password vaults available, that didn't exist back then. And we had to change our password, I want to say like every 30 days or 60 days. And like it grew from 8 characters to 12 characters to 18 characters to 24 characters at some point. And then you couldn't reuse the previous, 10 passwords. And then you couldn't have, repeating numbers or repeating letters. It was like really stringent stuff, to the point where we're just like, I'm just going to bash my head on the keyboard and put in a bunch of random stuff and hope that the thing accepts it. So we would do this keyboard walk a lot, right? We'd just kind of go down, hold shift and be like, exclamation mark with capital QAZ, and then let go of the shift and do like, the 2 and then lowercase WSX. So, you just kind of walk on the keyboard along, and that just makes it easy because it's a pattern on the keyboard in your, and so this is actually a common thing if you're not aware. Like there are a lot of people who just walk on the keyboard. This is why QWERTY is a very common password, because it's QWERTY right across the top there. So think about ways that you can block that, because I could put in QWERTY obviously, or QAZ or whatever, into the Azure password blocking tool, and it will block it.
Mm-hmm.
So make sure that you're thinking about that, as well as maybe just think about not having passwords in general, right? Like there are ways to become passwordless. We've talked about that on this show. There are ways to do that with Windows Hello for Business, the Authenticator app, FIDO2, so on and so forth. And speaking of FIDO2, if and you can, you should move to phish resistant MFA. Passkeys, I think, are still in preview, if that's correct, Adam.
Right.
But they're integrated right into your, Entra or Microsoft Authenticator app. And I had to actually use it on Friday. So all Microsoft employees, FTEs, moved to passkeys for our Authenticator as part of this SFI initiative, the Secure Future Initiative. And when I was signing into a new application on Friday, it prompted me for a passkey. And I do have a FIDO key, but then they're like, hey, would you like to use a passkey and scan? And so it popped up a little QR code. I scanned it with my Intune managed iOS device, and it has the passkey saved in the authenticator, and it signed me in. So it's a phish resistant MFA right there on my device. So, and Adam mentioned other signals, right? Are you using a managed device? Are you taking a look at that sign in and user risk based conditional access? So you can scope conditional access within Entra and say, high risk users or medium risk users, you must do an action before you can get in, and not just like, I showed you my MFA, I have the right username and password, let me in. Take a look at these other signals as part of that conditional access.
Mm-hmm.
We talked about insider risk protection as far as having a program, knowing your law enforcement contacts, consolidating your data into one source, not having it spread out. And then, of course, using generative AI or having some tools that can use it that will help your productivity. So just a few takeaways. Adam, I'll let you have some final thoughts here.
Yeah, you hit them all, man. That was fantastic. I had not really considered the keyboard walk. I obviously knew like basic ones like QWERTY and ASDF were, I assume, blocked, but it wouldn't hurt to take the extra step of adding some of those combinations you mentioned in, because modern password protection tools like Entra ID password protection will catch those in any combination. So no matter how somebody's walking the keyboard, like there's really no scenario you would type WSX, at least that I can think of. So let's just block that. Like we're not gonna have that here. Pick a different password. And that's a great point. Just having a password protection tool in general really helps getting rid of the most obvious and weak passwords and commonly used passwords is a nice win. You should, at this point, be deploying some version of a passwordless authentication. It may not be your only method. You may have to fall back to password. Sometimes that's fine. The only way we get to passwordless is by having credible alternatives. So that starts with doing something and going forward from there. Learning the rough edges too. How do you provision a user without telling them a password? Well, there's things like temporary access pass you can use, but are you prepared to do that? Is your new hire process ready for that kind of thing? If not, now's a good time to practice, learn the rough edges on that, figure it out. That's how we get there. You have to do the work. And so just saying, well, it's not perfect and it doesn't do everything, so we're not going to bother with it yet. It's the wrong approach. It's iterative. It's not boil the ocean all at once. You talked about phish resistant methods. At this point, I get you may not deploy to everyone. We did, but that's really hard. It's something that does take time, but again, you got to do the work. You got to start somewhere. Passkeys, keep a close eye on them. If you're not ready yet and you want to see a little more development, I get it. But if you want to do device-bound, non-syncable passkeys today, that's a thing. That is out. It's in public preview, but we're using it across 270,000 FTEs and contractors today at Microsoft. So it's being tested at scale in large enterprise. You could at least test it with 20 people in your IT department. I mean, it's fine. And then just incorporating those additional signals. I already touched on this, but if you don't have a linkage of your device management platform and your identity platform, you should. Those should be really tightly linked together. And can you bring in the signal from your EDR too? You should. And do you have dynamic risk with your login so that it's looking at, have you signed in from this PC before? Have you used this ISP before? Is this a familiar location? Is this a familiar country or city? Those are all things that this isn't rocket science at this point. It's kind of table stakes. Like if something drastically changes with the sign-in, we should require additional assurance that it's normal and it's okay to proceed. So we really, really need to get buttoned up on that. Insider risk, we touched on. There are IRM programs out there, insider risk management tools. Microsoft makes a good one. There's some others too. It might be time to look at them. Again, we talked about that maybe the largest in terms of raw dollar amount risk and everything we covered. Know where your data is. In general, don't look for solutions that duplicate data. That's kind of the really hidden risk here to me. I think it's more obvious of like have a data strategy, standardize on a single cloud, I think is a better overall strategy from this risk. But where I see security departments make the excuse of we're going to do data duplication because it's quote unquote more secure, I see things like we're going to use this third-party e-discovery tool. So we're going to take a dump of everything in a user mailbox and everything in their SharePoint and OneDrive and put it on a flash drive or put it on an SFTP site or something, and then go transfer it to this other tool. Well, now you have a duplicate of everything out there in an unencrypted fashion so that some other tool can read it. You've just duplicated a tremendous amount of data and a tremendous amount of risk. Because I'd be willing to bet a lot of times, if it's legal proceedings, it's like your C-suite. There's a lot of juicy stuff in their mailbox. So maybe a tool that works on that in place, does those searches in place, does those holds in place, and you only export at the very end of the process the minimum you need to respond to those proceedings, might be a better idea. Or I once had an organization tell me, our strategy for external collaboration is we have users make a copy of all their data and put it in Box because they know Box is our only tool that allows external collaboration. So they're going to take a copy of everything they have in SharePoint or OneDrive or Teams or whatever. We're going to move it into Box, and then that's the only place we allow external sharing. So essentially, they're creating more copies of, again, unencrypted data that they maybe have less management over, less data loss prevention over, less visibility and e-discovery into, in the name of security. Because their thought process was, well, at least if it's in Box, users know it can be externally shared. If it's in SharePoint, it's not always clear if it's shared externally or not. Well, to me, that's like a training problem because it's 101. Like, is it shared? Yes or no? You can tell very easily. But it was actually like the security department advocating for this data duplication strategy. I'm like, this is risk written all over it. You know, there's obvious risk there. We talk about retaining less, creating less, single cloud strategy, but watch out for those cases where you have a system in place where duplicating data is part of the workflow, because those are insidious methods of data leakage and lack of data discoverability. And then you have a final bullet on here too, use of AI. I think I'll make a final kind of statement there too. Don't be afraid of it. It's not going to take your job. It's really not. It's going to make you better, more productive, faster. It's going to make your job less drudgerous, less like banging your head against the wall, doing the same thing every day, staring at the matrix scrolling across your screen, and help you get to do more cool stuff that humans are good at, and let the computers do the stuff computers are good at. It's time to at least look at it, kick the tires on it. If it's not right, if it's not fully baked, then don't buy it. But there's plenty of vendors. Obviously, our employer's one of them, but there's plenty of others that are shipping really cool, really innovative products. And at this point, we need all the help we can get. Who are we to turn away from it because we're afraid it might take our jobs someday? Someday is a long way away. Someday is an infinite timeline. What I can tell you today is we're getting our butts kicked by these attackers, and anything we can do to make our jobs more pleasurable, less difficult, faster, more efficient, we should at least take a look at it, right? So I'll get off my soapbox there. Those are my final thoughts.
Good call outs, Adam. Well, that's our show for this week. Thanks for watching and listening as always. Our contact information is in the show notes if you have any questions or topics you want us to talk about in the future. Thanks. We'll talk to you guys next week.
Thank you for listening to the Blue Security Podcast. Please check out the show notes, catch up on episodes you may have missed, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Find Andy on Twitter @AJaw0 and Adam @AJBrewer. See you at our next episode.